I was 10 when I first wrote down my future on the back of one of my mother's balance sheets, a dusty, tea-stained page from her office, where numbers always made more sense than people did. I remember how I smoothed the paper against my thighs, legs dangling off the edge of my narrow bed, and how the ink bled slightly where my hand shook. I wrote about a life with soft corners. A wooden cabin near a quiet lake. A man who read with his feet propped against mine. 2 children who thought I was made of magic. And I, a writer, lost in pages but never in life. It was my blueprint. I folded it carefully and slid it beneath the socks my grandmother had knitted before she died. That paper felt like a promise only I could see. But already, things were falling apart. That winter, my father left. There was no dramatic fight, no slamming of doors. Just a missing coffee mug, an empty side of the closet, and the smell of his aftershave lingering in the hallway like a ghost that hadn't realized it was dead. My mother said nothing for days. She cooked in silence, a wooden spoon clenched like a weapon in her hand. Once, I heard her crying behind the laundry door, muffled by the churning of the washing machine and the metallic rattle of quarters. I tried to make her laugh by dancing in mismatched socks, playing music from the old radio in the kitchen. She watched, dry-eyed, her fingers still working the peeling sticker on a jar of pickles. She didn't smile. One night, I found her asleep at the kitchen table, head resting next to a stack of unpaid bills. I covered her with my school sweater and tiptoed to my room, where I opened the drawer and unfolded my paper. I traced the words with my finger, like I was willing them into existence. I didn't know, then, that fantasy is the most dangerous kind of hope, the kind that makes you believe the world owes you something beautiful for surviving the ugly. I started writing stories at night, mostly about girls who found secret doors and never came back. Girls who were brave and alone, but who somehow never felt lonely. Girls nothing like me. The house grew quieter in the weeks that followed. My little brother stopped asking when Dad was coming home. We all stopped pretending. But the blueprint remained, untouched in its hiding place, as if it could protect itself from the dust collecting in the corners of our lives. Looking back, it was the last time I truly believed that a dream on paper could shape a life. It was also the first time I realized that some people disappear without slamming the door, and that silence is its own kind of violence. By 23, the city had become both my prison and my playground. The skyline, jagged like broken promises, loomed over me as I rushed between temp jobs and second shifts, chasing rent, chasing time. The dream of the lake, the cabin, the pages of books with my name on them, they shrank with every bill notice, every cracked heel, every cup of coffee I couldn't afford but still needed. I lived in a third-floor walk-up that always smelled faintly of mold and cigarette smoke, with a ceiling that leaked when it rained and radiator pipes that coughed through the night like a dying animal. My upstairs neighbor practiced the violin badly, and the girl next door screamed in her sleep. I told myself it was temporary. I clung to that word like a life raft. Most mornings, I'd edit soul-killing educational material for online courses, swapping out one robotic phrase for another. My nights were spent in an underlit diner with sticky menus and coffee that could strip paint. I was the kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep, the kind that crawls into your bones and sets up camp. And then, he arrived. He was a quiet regular, came in every Tuesday and Friday, always sat at the corner booth, always ordered black coffee and eggs over medium. He didn't smile often, but when he did, it was slow and unguarded, like he'd forgotten how. Something about the sadness in his eyes mirrored my own, and it made me reckless. Or maybe just human. It started with casual glances, then grew into a rhythm, shared silence, borrowed warmth. We didn't fall in love. We collapsed into each other. His apartment was smaller than mine but cleaner, as though he still believed he might make something of himself. He was kind in bed, gentle in his anger, and quick to disappear into thought. I never asked where he went when he left for hours without texting. I didn't want to scare it all away. I told myself love didn't have to be loud to be real. When I got pregnant, we were both quiet. He rested a hand on my belly one night and stared at it like it might vanish. I remember thinking, he's already halfway gone. He tried, in his way. Bought prenatal vitamins, looked for better work, talked about moving to a bigger place. But there was always a flicker behind his eyes, that same flicker I'd seen in my father. The one that whispered, "Run." 3 months after our son was born, he did. No note. No explanation. Just an empty drawer, a buzzing silence, and a baby that wouldn't stop crying. I stood in the doorway for a long time, holding my son against my chest, listening to the city roar outside. I had never felt so still, or so utterly erased. I wanted to scream, to smash something, to fold myself back into the paper I wrote on as a child and disappear between the lines. Instead, I put the baby down, boiled water for formula, and sat at the edge of my bed. I didn't cry. I was too tired. Motherhood did not come to me the way it was supposed to. There was no glow, no sweet lullabies sung over pastel blankets. Instead, there was silence punctuated by screams, his and mine. My son, born 2 weeks early, had colic that seemed like a punishment no one could explain. He cried for hours every night, his tiny body rigid with discomfort, his face flushed with a kind of rage I didn't know a baby could feel. I would pace the apartment for hours, bouncing him until my arms felt like they were filled with cement. I learned the geography of the floorboards, which creaked, which didn't, because the wrong step could make him scream louder. My breasts leaked. My stitches burned. My skin turned gray in the mirror. I could barely recognize myself, and worse, I could no longer remember who I had been. I worked from home, not because I wanted to, but because daycare was a fantasy. I wrote copy for furniture catalogs, technical blog posts, wellness articles about self-love written by a woman who hadn't washed her hair in a week. I edited other people's dreams while mine turned to dust in the margins. Some days, I would stare at my son in his bassinet and wonder if he knew how much I loved him even when I wanted to disappear. I never told anyone that I sometimes had to place him in his crib and lock myself in the bathroom just to cry into a towel. Once, I fell asleep in the shower. I woke up shivering, the water long gone cold, and panicked, not because of myself, but because I hadn't heard him cry. I ran, dripping, into the living room only to find him asleep for the first time in hours. I sank to the floor, wrapped in a towel, and cried until it felt like I was bleeding salt. One day I called my mother. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice brittle like ice cracking over a lake. I told her I was tired. She said,
"You're strong."
I said nothing. We sat in silence, and in that silence was 1,000 things we would never say, how she'd once been where I was, how we'd both learned that strength is just the absence of any other option. When I visited her a few months later, she looked smaller, as though life had been shaving pieces off her slowly. Her hair was thinner, her eyes dimmer, but she still kept the house spotless, as if scrubbing away the years might bring something back. She died that December. A stroke. Alone in her kitchen, in the same chair she'd sat in the last time I saw her. It was a neighbor who found her. I missed 3 calls while changing a diaper. When I finally picked up, the world stopped, not with a bang, but with an unfamiliar voice saying,
"I'm sorry to tell you."
I went to her house alone, with my baby in my arms and a suitcase full of guilt. There were no instructions, no will, just a drawer full of old tax forms and a recipe for a chicken stew I never learned how to make. I stood in her kitchen and turned on the radio. Nothing came out but static. That night, I found an old photo of us, her, smiling in the sunlight, holding my hand, both of us laughing, young, untouched by the weight of what was to come. I pressed my forehead against the glass frame and whispered, "I'm sorry." Though I didn't know which of us I was saying it to. Time didn't pass so much as it circled, a quiet orbit of laundry, bills, grocery lists, emails, and meals reheated twice. My son grew up quietly, the kind of child who always seemed to be listening for a door that might close. He had his father's solemn eyes and my mother's posture, shoulders always slightly braced, as if expecting the sky to fall. By 7, he had already learned to make his own breakfast. By 10, he stopped asking why we never celebrated Father's Day. He rarely cried. That was the part that broke me most. At night, after he fell asleep, I would sit in the hallway outside his room and listen to his breathing. I found myself searching for signs, anything that would tell me he was still soft inside. Still reachable. Still innocent. I'd often lie awake imagining what I would say if his father came back, the cruel, cutting monologue I had crafted and recrafted in the shower, in traffic, during school plays. But I never used it. He never came back. And rage, like milk, spoils when left unattended too long. Eventually, it curdled into something sour and private. I wrote in fragments. Late at night, between the quiet and the exhaustion, I opened blank Word documents and poured pieces of myself into them, not full stories, just whispers. A woman staring out a window. A man with a key that didn't fit any door. A child who swallowed silence like it was soup. I submitted some of the pieces. A few were published, small bylines in obscure literary journals. I should have felt proud. But all I felt was how far away my original dream had drifted. The cabin, the lake, the bookshelf with my name etched into a hardcover, all of it now felt like something I had imagined in another life, one I could no longer access. Every once in a while, I'd open the old drawer, the one that had traveled with me from childhood through every apartment and every chapter. Inside was the scrap of paper, now worn thin at the creases. I didn't read it anymore. I just held it, the way one holds a photograph of someone who left before they should have. I started aging out of things. Job offers. Friendships. Dating apps. People assumed I was too busy or too damaged to be interested. Maybe they were right. I didn't want to be known anymore. I only wanted to be remembered, quietly, by someone who might wonder, years from now, how I had managed to keep going. One spring morning, my son came home from school and said he wanted to live with his father for a while. He said it casually, like a weather report. I froze. My hands trembled as I picked up his empty lunchbox. I nodded. I didn't ask how he'd found him. I didn't ask if his father had called. I didn't want to cry in front of him, not again. He had seen me break once, after my mother died. That had been enough. He left 2 weeks later, suitcase in hand, taller than me now, his face carved in shadows I'd never learned to read. When the door clicked shut behind him, it was the quietest sound I'd ever heard. But it echoed for days. The apartment felt too big without him. I kept cooking too much food. I still set 2 plates. The houseplants died slowly, not from neglect, but from the absence of anyone who noticed. I told myself I was fine. That I was free now. But I missed the sound of his pencil scratching homework. I missed the muttered night, Mom through the wall. I missed his scent, a mixture of soap, boyhood, and something uniquely his, that still lingered on his hoodie, folded in the laundry basket weeks later. I stopped writing for a while. I walked around my life like it was someone else's, clean, organized, sterile. I worked. I smiled when appropriate. I even got drinks with colleagues. But I was drifting, like a radio between stations, full of static, full of ghosts. The only thing that brought me back, eventually, was the act of writing itself. Not for others. Not for money. But for me. I reopened the old folder on my desktop, someday, and began typing again. The characters were older now. Bruised. Tired. But they survived, somehow. Just like me. By 50, I had learned how to vanish in plain sight. The lines around my eyes deepened, not just from age, but from squinting through decades of fatigue, of grief, of waiting for things that never returned. My hands, once nimble on keyboards and diaper tabs, now ached after an hour of typing. The world had moved on, faster and louder than I could follow. My son called occasionally, on birthdays, on Mother's Day, when guilt caught up to him. His voice had changed. Deeper. Almost formal. There were long pauses between words, like we were both trying to pretend this was still the same river we used to swim in, even though time had long since changed its course. I stopped reminding him to call. I told myself this was what independence looked like. That it meant I had raised him strong. But some nights, I fell asleep clutching my phone, hoping it would ring. It rarely did. I worked part-time at a community library, shelving books for children who didn't know what a card catalog was. I found quiet joy in this, the feel of pages, the echo of stories, the routine. But there were moments, when I passed the fiction section and saw the names of authors who had once been peers, or worse, students, that a wave of something bitter would rise. Not jealousy. Something quieter. Regret, maybe. Recognition of a life unlived. One rainy afternoon, I found the paper. The blueprint. I had moved again, smaller apartment, closer to the bus line, no stairs. I was sorting through a forgotten box of clothes and found it tucked inside an old sock. The paper was soft now, nearly translucent, the ink faded like breath on a mirror. I read the words slowly, like a prayer. Cabin. Lake. Books. Love. Children. Peace. None of it had come true. Not in the way I had imagined. And yet, I didn't cry. I didn't feel rage. I felt something else entirely, like I was staring at the version of myself I had once rooted for with all the fierce, foolish hope a child can muster. She hadn't failed. She had simply lived. In the way people do, clumsily, bravely, with broken shoes and full hearts and nothing ever quite going to plan. I deleted the someday folder that night. Not out of anger. But because someday had come and gone so many times. It was no longer a promise, it was a shadow. And I wanted to walk forward without it. I went for a walk. The air was sharp, filled with the scent of rain-soaked pavement and something blooming nearby, jasmine or honeysuckle, I never could tell the difference. Children raced past me, laughing, one dragging a kite that had collapsed like a fallen star. Their joy was loud, wild, untouched. I watched them until they disappeared into the blur of dusk. There was a woman across the street, younger, holding a baby on her hip and groceries in her other arm. She looked like me, once. Tired. Determined. Holding too much and dropping none of it. I wanted to tell her that it would be okay. That it would be brutal and beautiful and not at all what she thought. That some dreams come true quietly, in sideways glances and long-forgotten poems. That love doesn't always stay, but strength does. But I said nothing. I just nodded when our eyes met. When I returned home, I made tea and sat by the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered to life one by one. Inside, the silence was no longer empty. It was mine. Owned. Earned. My fantasy had ended. But the story, my story, had become something else entirely. Not a tragedy. Not a triumph. Just real. And sometimes, real is the most heartbreaking kind of magic there is.